I've ever used that particular tactic.
Welcome to Secrets of a Murder Detective.
The killing of Christopher Proctor in November 2012 was one of Blackburn's most upsetting cases. I'm meeting with a senior investigating officer on the case to understand what really happened, the pressures, the setbacks, and the techniques used to bring the killer to justice.
I'm retired Detective Superintendent P.17, who worked for Lancashire Police for 30 years. I've been retired from the police service 4 years now, and this particular case will live with me forever.
Peter, thanks very much for coming in.
No problem, thank you.
Peter, the case we're talking about today is from November 2012. What were you doing then? What was your role?
So I was the senior investigating officer, one of a few senior investigating officers in Lancashire Constabulary.
And an incident happened and you were called to it, or how did it...
It had occurred in the early hours of Saturday morning.
Emergency route service.
I came on duty at 8 o'clock as normal and was given the handover from the team on night. So in the early hours of Saturday, the 10th of November 2012, the police and the fire service were informed via 999 of a fire at a premises in Blackburn.
So at around about 3:45 in the morning, somebody's walking down the street and they see an orange glow in the distance. So my name's Jason Dean, and I'm a forensic fire investigator. When they go and investigate, they realise that property's on fire, and they subsequently raise the alarm to the authorities.
The patrols attended, the fire service attended, and the fire was heavily ablaze at the house. They extinguished the fire and tragically and sadly discovered the body of an elderly gentleman in the house. The deceased in this particular case we identified was an 88-year-old man called Christopher Proctor.
So you're on a murder investigation team.
Yeah.
Fire in a house with somebody in it don't necessarily mean it's suspicious. What was it that made the murder investigation team got involved?
Well, it was far too early to say what had actually gone on within the house and the cause of the fire. There were a number of what the police call hypotheses, a number of legitimate lines of enquiry, and could this have been an accidental fire that the occupant had started accidentally? Could this have been a deliberate fire started by the house owner? Or was this actually an intentional act caused by a third party? And at that stage of the enquiry, it was far too early to say. But at the back of my mind, I was thinking, was this a criminal act that could have gone wrong and the person had set fire deliberately to get rid of any evidence or any incriminating stuff that he may have left behind? So on that Saturday morning, I appointed an enquiry team dedicated to this particular enquiry in order to establish exactly the circumstances in which Christopher had lost his life. And more importantly, to understand how the fire had started. So I had an array of assets and resources at my disposal. We were conducting house-to-house enquiries within the local area. We were trawling CCTV systems. It was incredibly important for me to put the pieces of the jigsaw together in order to understand exactly what had happened.
In murder investigations where there's been a fire at a crime scene, that can prove to be a real challenge for investigators. Fires, by their very nature, are destructive, which means they will destroy things like fingerprints and DNA, which will create a real challenge to identify a killer and place them at a crime scene.
And so that very morning, because of the fact that the fire had been so intense and the fire service had actually extinguished the fire, I made the decision to call out a forensic scientist who was a specialist in fires, a crime scene manager, but also we utilised the services of the fire service, who had a principal fire investigator as well. So those three people, for me, were absolutely key. The fire had absolutely devastated the house. It had virtually destroyed the entirety of it, and it was important to me to understand where the fire had started, what they call the seat of the fire.
The thing with a fire when it develops is as it burns, items start to fall on top of each other. So the evidence we're looking for might be at the bottom of it. It's been protected because all the debris falls on top of each other. It's protecting it. So when we excavate the scene, we find out our radius of error or our area where we think the fire may have started. And we work from furthest away to that area so we don't compromise the scene and we can examine every possible ignition source as we work our way through.
And I didn't know at that stage, was it a chip pan fire that had gone wrong? Was it a faulty electrical item? I know from the past that I've been to fatal house fires that have been accidental. And this could well have been another one of those tragic cases of an accidental house fire.
But in the meantime, you're treating it as if it could be a murder because you can't get that time back.
Exactly.
An important strand from your investigation is going to be talking to Christopher's neighbours, the people that live around him, to see what was going on. What sort of information were you getting from them?
Well, clearly part of it was about who Christopher was and how he went about his daily business. But what was coming out from those house-to-house inquiries and from his neighbours and close people was that Christopher had had people around at his home address doing odd jobs for him. There was a suspicion from their perspective that they were possibly taking advantage of him. So these were the kind of other strands of information that were very, very quickly coming into the inquiry.
So one of your priorities would have been to build up a picture of Christopher and his life, etc.
Absolutely. And one of the main priorities, clearly, and a difficult one, obviously, because of the circumstances in which Christopher had met his death, was to speak to the family, to understand who Christopher was, where was he from, what's his background, what was he doing. And we very, very quickly, within that first few hours, started to get a bit of a picture as to who Christopher was.
And what was that picture telling you?
Well, he was an 88-year-old gentleman, very, very well loved by his family, quite an active person. And as his family said, you know, he had years in front of him. He was a Cambridge-educated gentleman. He got a degree from Cambridge in linguistics. He taught for the best part of 40 years at the college in Blackburn. And he was a very well-known, respected gentleman.
In terms of being a potential victim, I think it's fair to say that Christopher Proctor was an easy target. He was elderly and he lived alone. My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. Now, at the age of 88, he was becoming quite deaf. So obviously, this makes him vulnerable as a potential target for criminals.
Victimology is hugely important in murder investigations, and that is because generally there's a link between a victim and a killer. The police will be looking at the victim's life to understand who is in it. And that will be particularly important for those they interacted with in the time leading up to the murder.
A big piece of information that we received from Christopher's family was that he had been the victim of a fraud a number of months previous, in whereby somebody had stolen £250 from his bank account. I appointed some financial investigators to trawl through Christopher's bank details in order to try and establish what exactly had happened. And pretty quickly we started to get a picture unravelling that people were seeking to take money from him fraudulently. People doing odd jobs for him, working on his car, working on his property, and Christopher would pay them cash. But the intelligence being that they were intent on trying to access his bank details via his house, sneak into his property and take his cash cards.
So in your mind, at this early stage, as you have to do, you're keeping an open mind.
Yeah.
But then this picture is starting to form that actually There's stuff going on within Christopher's life that is concerning, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah, and that sort of that sets your sort of spider senses, for want of a better word, tingling a little bit. He's been a victim of a deception or a fraud type offence. Could this be something that's gone horribly wrong that particular night? And it was really important to me to make sure that we had a clear understanding as to what Christopher's financial current situation was, but then to overlay that with some pretty rapid and quick CCTV. And the dots started to join together. Following further financial investigation, we actually established that there had been 2 attempted transactions at Christopher's bank in the early hours of the morning, the same morning where the fire had started. A high line of priority for me that particular weekend was to trawl all the CCTV from Christopher's home address down to the ATMs where the attempted transaction of his bank account had occurred. So officers were trawling the streets, door to door, trying to establish and piece together any movements of individuals who may have been wandering around that night.
What was that showing you?
So Christopher had actually been out. He left his home address on the Friday night and he actually changed his PIN number. So why was that? What was he thinking of doing there? What was the reason behind him changing that PIN number? These were the questions that I was starting to ask. Christopher had withdrawn £30 cash that evening, and then the last sighting of him is actually coming back to his home address.
The fact that we see Christopher Proctor changing his PIN number shows me that he's a little bit worried about being victimised and perhaps a little bit heightened to danger.
Although you don't know what has happened at this stage, you must start getting concerns that something untoward has happened to Christopher.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. And for me, that ups the ante. It raises the bar. And I've got a scene where I've got fire examiners conducting what has gone on at Christopher's house. But then I've also got what I believe is a criminal unlawful act of somebody trying to withdraw money out of Christopher's bank account in the early hours of Saturday morning. And I don't believe that that is Christopher. So incredibly important for me to quickly get the CCTV from those 2 transactions to try and find out who exactly it is.
So when someone puts a card into a cash machine, not all the time, but the majority of them are going to have a camera inside. It's
Yes.
going to give an indication as to who's carrying out that transaction.
Yeah, banks are pretty proficient with their ATMs, and like you say, not all of them, but on this particular case, we were able to capture and recover the CCTV from those ATM withdrawals.
And what did they show you?
Well, it showed 2 people, one larger than the other. Clearly not Christopher. So, again, incredibly good evidence. One wearing a beanie-style hat, 2 people basically trying to withdraw money out of the account, but the financial overlay of that was that it was a failed attempt. So I knew that they'd put the wrong PIN number in, and that was the evidence that we were presented with.
So as a senior investigating officer, you're relying on people to do certain elements of the investigation. And crucially, in this instance, will be the examinations of the crime scene where the fire took place.
Yeah.
So what the fire officers did notice when they went into the property, that the back door had been forcibly opened, hanging off its hinges. So when the perpetrator enters the property through forced entry, because obviously it was secure, they've damaged the back door to the extent it's evident that it's been damaged.
And whilst we were tiptoeing our way through trying to establish how the fire had started and the seat of the fire, some information that came in from the crime scene manager, which I believed was clearly significant, was that Christopher's telephone cable had been unplugged out of the socket. That, to me, shows a degree of pre-planning and sinister, and somebody who clearly did not want Christopher to be able to use his phone that night.
And to set fire to the property with the back door being open because it was off its hinges helped ventilate that fire and helped it develop quickly. It's a horrendous crime.
For some arsonists, the actual act of setting the fire is the motivation, so they get a thrill from doing this. But to me, this seems like something different. The fact that somebody would set a fire in a residence to cover their tracks suggests to me that they just don't care about the consequences. They don't care if other people are injured or even killed.
Another important element would be CCTV. You'll be building up a picture of Christopher's movements in and around the house, who may have been their visitors, neighbours around seeing what's going on. It can be a lot of work, can't it?
The amount of work that we put into the CCTV trawl for this particular investigation cannot be underestimated. We trawled garage forecourts, ATM machines, people's private CCTV at their home addresses, and we had a team of about 8 detectives working on that, literally to try and put the pieces of that CCTV together. Part of that was to understand Christopher's movements that particular night, but as equally important, to try and find out who had actually been out and about in the early hours of that morning.
One of the important elements to this is going to be a post-mortem, or also known as an autopsy.
Yeah.
And that will be conducted by a forensic pathologist
Yes.
who will examine Christopher to try and establish a cause of death.
So the post-mortem examination was even more important with this particular case simply because we got a very charred, fire-damaged body. So we had nothing visible to look at the scene that would show you whether Christopher had inhaled smoke or not. So obviously, when it goes away for autopsy, then there's a more intrusive examination carried out on Christopher's body that can show the soot in his airways.
Following the conclusion of Christopher's post-mortem by a forensic pathologist, he informed me that Christopher had not ingested any soot or tar into his lungs, which basically meant that Christopher was dead before the fire had started. So, for me as the SIO, was an incredible sort of stage of the investigation, knowing that Christopher had burnt in the fire after his death, so the fire could only have been caused by a third party.
So essentially now, you must be starting to think, well, this is looking like a murder.
Yeah, and that's when I raised it as a definite murder inquiry.
So the pathologist at the post-mortem will be trying to establish a cause of death. He's already established that death occurred before the fire took hold because there was no soot in the lungs.
Yeah.
Were they able to establish how Christopher died?
At that stage, he wasn't. He didn't give us a full causation of Christopher's death. He did, however, tell us that Christopher suffered from coronary heart disease, and that may be a cause of his death, but it was too early to say. But interestingly as well, Christopher had an injury to the front of his nose, so these were two aspects of understanding the cause of Christopher's death, and the pathologist wanted to undergo further histology tests in order for us to fully understand and determine what exactly had caused his death.
At any crime scene, it will go through various stages. Initially, things will be photographed, then you have forensic scientists, etc., coming down. But at some stage, you're going to want to understand exactly what is in that scene. And for that, police use specialist-trained search officers. I assume you brought those in at some stage?
Yeah, we did. We brought the search teams in on the Monday, which was 2 days after the fire had been reported. We set them a task of looking in the drains in the local area, and we actually found discarded within those drains Christopher's checkbook and wallet.
So that would have been hugely important.
Hugely important because, once again, it just corroborates the fact that, you know, we're dealing with a criminal act here. Our hunch of this being a burglary gone incredibly wrong, we knew we were on the right path.
Of course, it doesn't take a high level of criminal cunning to burgle the house of an elderly, vulnerable man, but it does feel like a sloppy and chaotic way to try and cover their tracks when something went wrong. The fact that these perpetrators would do something as callous and as risky as setting a residence on fire, to me, shows that they completely lacked compassion in that moment. All they cared about was getting away.
You've got a murder.
Yeah.
You've got some cards that have been used at Christopher's, and you've got 2 people.
Yeah.
You now need to identify who these people are. How did you go around doing that?
So you've touched on the fact that we've got 2 people withdrawing money from Christopher's card at the ATM machine. So a huge high priority line of inquiry for me was, who are these 2 individuals? They've clearly been able to source Christopher's cards, likely from his home address. So I quickly wanted to know, where have they come from? Where are they going to? Who are they? So the main focus of the inquiry, the main focus of the investigation was to try and identify who these 2 were. We plotted them walking through the streets of Blackburn. We actually plotted them on CCTV on various streets. We see them walking through the streets of Blackburn towards the address of Christopher. We actually plot them walking up the drive of Christopher's home address. That is the last sighting of those 2 individuals, so clearly significant. The CCTV then shows them 2 hours later coming down the drive of Christopher's home address, back through the streets of Blackburn, and we then pick them up at the ATM machine where they try to make the withdrawal from the cash machine, but fail.
So they've been in Christopher's house for around 2 hours?
Yes.
That's a long time, isn't it?
It is a long time, and the hypothesis being that they are clearly looking for cards, PIN numbers, to use at the cash machine.
So at this stage, you've got 2 people moving around, and you can be in no doubt whatsoever that whatever's happened to Christopher, these 2 people are responsible for. There's no doubt there, is there? You need to now identify who these are.
Media appeals are a very important part of any murder investigation, and a great deal of thought will go into them. And quite often, these media appeals are the best way of getting hold of people to come forward with information that may identify a killer, identify a witness, or provide the circumstances around a crime.
The public are incredibly important to any investigation such as this, just regarding any little bits of information that they may well know that could be the vital piece of the jigsaw. So we appealed to the public, and we started to get the names through of individuals who could have been taking advantage of Christopher. So it was really important to me as the SIO that we identified who those individuals were and began to basically shake the tree and saw what fell out of it. Over the next 24, 36 hours, we actually arrested 6 individuals from the local area. That clearly upset the apple cart within that sort of local sort of criminal fraternity network, and 2 names very, very quickly came forward as a result of shaking that tree.
So what were the names?
So we got the names of Claire Randall and Anthony Curry.
Police received information that the pair had potentially been trying to con Proctor by befriending him and exploiting his loneliness. I would say that it's relatively common in fraud cases for the perpetrator to try and befriend the victim to extract information and vulnerabilities about them.
CCTV inquiries had actually established Anthony Curry going into an appointment earlier on that morning wearing quite a unique beanie hat, and that beanie hat was seen to be worn by one of the individuals making the withdrawal from the ATM.
An important element for you would be building up an intelligence picture of these 2 people. What was that showing you?
Curry was well known to the police for theft, dishonesty, burglary type offences. Claire Randall, his girlfriend, she was known for similar type offences. Both were known drug users, drug dependent, and again, For me as the SIO, it was incredibly important that these two people who were still at large within the community were arrested immediately.
A very high number of burglaries are committed in the context of drug addiction, and sometimes the criminals are suffering so badly with withdrawal that it clouds their judgment, and they will do almost anything to get that next fix.
So the fire started in the early hours of Saturday morning, and by the Tuesday morning, the police were in a position to make the arrests of Anthony Curry and Claire Randall.
How did that go?
Yeah, we went round to the home address, locked them up in the early hours of the morning, brought them into custody, and began hours and hours of interviews with them. Whilst we put all the questions to them, they both provided no comment. Didn't really come much as a surprise to me. We see it a lot. And again, for me, it was the advice of their legal team, and it was just another challenge for us to get over.
But at some point, you have to make a decision.
Yeah.
Do we have enough to go to the Crown Prosecution Service to charge?
Yeah.
Or am I going to have to bail them out to come back at a later stage?
Yeah.
So where did you get while they were in custody?
Well, we had them for 24 hours. We extended their detention for another 12 hours through to 36 hours. And a lot of people think it's a degree of failure for people to go out on police bail, but I always believed in that this is the long game. We're not playing a short game here, we're playing a long game, and it will allow us more time to gather evidence against these two. I was more than satisfied that we had the right two people, but at that moment in time, we simply did not have enough evidence to charge them. And whilst it was frustrating that they both had to go out on police bail because they were going back out into the community, I was pretty confident that we would finally get there.
So you're confident you've got the right two people, but you need to get the evidence now to be able to firstly go to the Crown Prosecution Service and then ultimately go to court.
Yeah.
So what plan did you put in place?
So I approached a colleague of mine who was a detective superintendent in charge of our covert unit with a plan or a view of us putting two listening devices into the home address of Anthony Curry and Claire Randall. They both lived together, both boyfriend and girlfriend, and I felt, as the two main suspects in this case, that a good line of inquiry would be for us to establish whether they would be talking about what had happened that night.
So, as you're telling me, I know, listening to you, that isn't something that happens a lot.
No.
That's not a usual line of inquiry.
No.
That's you thinking out the box.
Yeah.
How can we get the evidence that we need? So,
yeah.
This isn't something that police do all the time.
No, and in all my years as a police officer, it is the first and the last time that I've ever used that particular tactic. One, it is incredibly intrusive. You're intruding into somebody's private life. You clearly have to have the grounds to do so. And these decisions can't be taken lightly. And, you know, there was briefing after briefing after briefing for the authority to be granted by the Chief Constable in order for him to be satisfied that this was a lawful, proportionate and a necessary tactic.
So you've now set up listening devices in somebody's house.
Yeah.
And that will be listened to live, right?
Yes.
Which takes a lot of resources, doesn't it? Because that's 24 hours a day, somebody listening to it. What were you starting to pick up from this?
We were hoping to pick up chatter between the two of them about what had gone on that particular evening, but frustratingly so, after they'd been bailed back to the home address and after the listening device had been installed at their home address, because of the resentment towards the two of them from the local community and from the manner in which Christopher had died, they had a brick thrown through their front room window and threats to firebomb the house. So all that work that had gone into installing those listening devices into that home address quickly came to an abrupt end because I had a duty of care to those two individuals. Even though they were suspects, their welfare, their well-being had to be maintained. So we had to get them out into a place of safety.
That must have been so frustrating.
It was. I remember we were scratching our heads. We wondered what the next step would be. But like anything, you know, we dealt with what was presented in front of us at the time. We then had to get the listening devices out of that home address. And then the next phase for me was, right, where are they going to go and live? We need to get them away from that locality. But then I wanted to do the same tactic in the new house. We quickly discovered within 12 to 16 hours of them being relocated, both of them were starting to incriminate themselves about their responsibility in Christopher's death and what had gone on that night.
The net is closing around these two individuals. They know that they're high on the list as police suspects. The fact that they would speak so openly and freely about what happened, completely unoblivious to the fact that they were being bugged by the police, suggests to me that they were perhaps naive to the depths that the police will go to investigate this.
The evidence, the chatter between the two of them was absolute gold dust dynamite for this particular investigation. I think without it, the case was at best circumstantial. But here was Curry putting himself in the home address of Christopher, intent on stealing from him, Randall acting as the lookout, and the pair of them committing crimes intent on stealing money. So we were absolutely delighted, the fact that both of them were talking about what they'd done that night.
I mean, you must have been, because you've been through getting authority in the first place,
Yeah.
getting it in the house,
Yeah.
having that incident with the brick,
Yeah.
then getting it in the other house.
Yeah.
It's justified everything you've done.
It was a sense of relief. It was a sense of justification. As I said, it was a tactic I'd never deployed or used before. Elation is probably too strong a word, but absolutely knowing that we had done everything in order to bring justice to Christopher's family, that we had the right individuals, we'd gone out on a limb to try and get to the bottom of what had happened. Yeah, we were really, really pleased. And it very, very quickly became apparent that we had sufficient evidence, new evidence now because of the conversations that they were having, for us to rearrest them on suspicion of Christopher's murder. So we made that decision and we brought them both back into police custody.
I always find this fascinating when you've interviewed somebody at one stage, then you present them with evidence that they would not have been expecting. They would not have been expecting recording devices in their houses. How did they react to that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. They were deflated. It was like the life had been sucked out of them. They wasn't expecting it, but being as they were, they continued to provide no comment interviews, but that didn't bother us in the slightest. And we were more than satisfied that we had a good case. I was in the background liaising with the Crown Prosecution Service at the time. They were satisfied with the evidence that we'd gathered, and they authorised Curry to be charged with Christopher's murder, arson, burglary and attempt theft, and Randall to be charged with burglary and attempt theft. So for me as the SIO and all the inquiry team working on this inquiry, we were all incredibly proud. We got to the point where we managed to secure charges against the two main suspects in this case, but that was only part of the investigation. The hard work started post-charge in delivering and bringing a case together to the Crown Courts.
In order to prove either murder or manslaughter against the defendant, The prosecution need to demonstrate causation. That is, that the defendant carried out an act that directly led to the victim's death. If they can't prove that, they can't prove either of those offences. Having now charged Curry and Randall, you need to get a case together for court.
Yeah.
Hugely important element in that, in any murder inquiry, is to establish exactly how somebody died.
Yes.
Initially, that was difficult.
Yeah.
Made doubly difficult because of the fact that Christopher died in fire.
Yeah.
How did you get to a stage where you were comfortable and you could say to a court how he died?
This one aspect of the investigation, it caused us some frustration because for any murder investigation, you have to prove an intention to kill or an intention to commit grievous bodily harm. And Christopher had severe heart disease, and the pathologist determined that any stressful incident would have brought on a heart attack. And he was of the opinion that the stress brought on with the burglary and seeing another person in his house that night, that was the contributing factor that will have caused his death. As a result of that, we liaised with the Crown Prosecution Service and the barrister dealing with our particular case, and they both felt that the better charge was that of manslaughter and not murder.
Now, you know that as somebody involved in the law and the lawyers and the CPS, etc. But this is a message that you're going to have to then convey to Christopher's family.
Yeah.
How did that go?
Believe it or not, it went well. Christopher's family were hugely dignified, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people, incredibly supportive of the police investigation throughout. Had built up such a fantastic relationship with the family liaison officers. The communication and the dialogue that we'd had with them throughout, yes, they were disappointed, but they fully understood.
The fire investigation is trying to establish how a fire started and where a fire started. It can be an incredibly long process.
Yeah.
At some stage, though, the fire investigators would have been able to tell you some more details around the fire. What were they telling you?
There are a lot of combustible items within Christopher's home address, a lot of paper, and clearly we overlaid not only the examination of the scene at Christopher's home address by the scientists and the fire investigation team, but also the stuff that Curry had said himself within the covert listening devices, was that he started the fire with a rag, and it started in the lounge.
So the fuel that's in the lounge or in the living room of the property makes all the difference. So the materials that you set fire to need to be of the density and the type of material that will catch fire easy by putting a burning rag onto them. So soft furnishings like armchairs, cushions, curtains, things like that, they're all readily ignitable. And if you put a rag onto them, that burning rag will have enough heat energy to set fire to other items in the room.
It was absolutely abundantly clear that he'd started that fire with a view to literally trying to just basically look after himself, get rid of any incriminating evidence, any DNA evidence, any fingerprint evidence. For me, it was completely inhumane, it was degrading, showed no act of mercy whatsoever.
Was there ever a chance that he could have saved his life if he had even just put in a phone call to 999?
Yeah, absolutely. He displayed an utter disregard of what had happened to Christopher.
So having been through the investigation, you start to build up a picture. It all starts to come in from the various different sources, CCTV, family, house to house, forensics at the scene. What's the final picture you built up of what went on that night?
So we've clearly got Christopher leaving his home address to go to the cash machine that night. He draws out £30 and then comes back to his home address. We then have Curry and Randall captured on CCTV walking late Friday night, early hours of Saturday morning, up to Christopher's driveway. Both of them leave the address, walk down to the ATM. 2 attempts at trying to withdraw money from Christopher's bank account, but failed. Curry then takes it upon himself to go back to the address, searching for the correct PIN number. Disturbs Christopher from his sleep, causes the death of Christopher because of the stress brought on with such a horrific incident, and then sets fire to Christopher's house. So that was the evidence and the full picture that we presented to the Crown Prosecution Service.
Curry was charged with murder, but having looked at all the circumstances, and especially around how Christopher died, a decision was made that the more appropriate charge should be manslaughter. How did that affect what went on after that?
Well, it changed significantly in that Curry and his defence team entered a guilty plea at court at the first available opportunity. So Anthony Curry accepted a plea of manslaughter, arson, burglary and attempted theft, and Claire Randall accepted a plea of burglary and attempted theft. Both of them pleaded at Preston Crown Court. That, in one aspect, prevented the family through weeks and weeks of listening to evidence, and it brought the matter to a conclusion, and the 2 individuals that caused Christopher's death were brought to justice. Carolyn, Christopher's daughter, gave a very, very powerful impact statement, allowing the judge to read the impact that Christopher's death had had on her and her family. You know, Christopher was a great-grandfather, a grandfather and a father, and the remaining thought that she had was what Christopher had gone through in the final moments of his life. And the judge took all that into account, and he said he was moved to tears with it, which is incredibly impacted.
When people put in a plea to a crime, they will often put in reasons behind it and what the circumstances were.
Yeah.
Did they ever give any indication of what that was? What were the circumstances? What went on inside that house?
You know, well, Curry put together, as part of his defence case and mitigation, if you will, that yes, he had been intent on stealing from Christopher, that on Christopher waking from his sleep, Curry had tried to escape. Fleeing the house, he'd slammed the door in Christopher's face, causing an injury to his nose. Curry, realising that Christopher had died as a result of the stress brought on, he panicked and set fire to the house. And like the judge said, that was something that only he knew, but that was the case that he put forward. It was a bittersweet moment for me as the SIO and the inquiry team to actually know that they were both going to plead guilty for their actions that particular night, but bitter in that we'd worked incredibly hard to secure murder charges. But this was the right decision. It was the right decision to take. It was the right decision in law. And the police have got to work with the law. We've got to work with the Crown Prosecution Service and the courts. And the judge rightly sentenced them accordingly. Curry to 12 years and Randall to 2.5 years. So for me as the SIO, it was a satisfactory outcome.
Ultimately, you got justice for Christopher, and that's what it's about, isn't it?
That's exactly what it's about. Right from the very outset, you know, the message to all the investigation team throughout is justice for Christopher, justice for Christopher's family. So at the heart of all this is Christopher and his family. As the SIO, I actually went to visit the family a few weeks ago, and whilst they don't want to appear in front of the camera, they have asked for me to express what and who Christopher was. Christopher was a loving soul whose life was extinguished by the actions of Curry. But the family will never, ever forget the events that unfolded that particular week, and they have never, ever forgotten Christopher.
When talking to Peter about this case, I was struck by the impact that this had on the community in Blackburn. I think this was largely to do with the fact that he was an elderly man in his own home, asleep in his own bed, when he was preyed upon because of his vulnerabilities. And I can't speak for Peter, but in his situation, I can see that he went that extra mile, and it was that was needed to convict the killer and get the justice that Christopher rightly deserved.